controversy. My name is Jonathan Draper, and I'm General Secretary of Modern Church. And this series, organized by Modern Church, is designed to mark the 100th anniversary of a conference that took place at Girton College in Cambridge in 1921 on Christ and the Creeds. Those were days when a theological conference seemed to matter. It attracted reporters from major newspapers, resulted in leading articles in them, even had influence on the doctrinal direction of the Church of England. One can hardly imagine that today. We have, nonetheless, engaged some prominent thinkers and theologians to be with us for this series. Next week, Jonathan Clatworthy is speaking on imperial theology and the Nicene Creed. The following week, Alan Race, chair of Modern Church, will speak on the question, does it matter if Jesus did not think he was divine? But we begin the series this evening with Professor Mark Chapman. Mark is Vice Principal of Ripon College, Cuddesdon in Oxford, Professor of the History of Modern Theology at Oxford, and Canon Theologian of Truro Cathedral. I hope Mark won't mind me mentioning that he followed me into his current post at Cuddesdon, and unlike me, has made a remarkable success of his time there. Mark has written widely, and some of his recent books include Theology at War and Peace, English Theology and Germany in the First World War, Theology and Society in Three Cities, Berlin, Oxford, and Chicago, The Fantasy of Reunion, Anglicans, Catholics, and Ecumenism. He's also, with our own Martin Percy, edited the Oxford Handbook of Anglican Studies. Few are better qualified than Mark Chapman to begin this series. Mark has also, as a member of the Church of England's General Synod, been part of the working group on the bishop's teaching document, Living in Love and Faith. So it's a great pleasure to ask Mark to give the first lecture, Jesus, Liberals, and Christian Civilization. There will be, at the end, an opportunity for questions and comments, if the technology is willing. If you want to ask a question, please use the chat box function on YouTube. Mark, I invite you to give our first lecture in this series.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, and good evening, everybody. It's even different live streaming through YouTube because I can't see anybody except the hosts here. So it really is talking into the ether. This is something that it would be unimaginable to the Girton Conference of 1921. I've given my talk a rather portentous kind of title, Jesus, Liberals, and Christian Civilization. I'm not going to say very much about Jesus. I'm not going to say very much about Christian civilization either, but I'll say quite a lot about liberals and the effect that the Girton Conference had on, if you like, the increasing polarization of the Church of England. It sort of set the agenda for some of the development of the church after the 1920s. But it's never really straightforward to assess the importance of any historical event. Any event is likely to have a short-term effect, but also a kind of longer-term afterlife. Some of that afterlife might be rather less transparent and rather less direct, and consequently less straightforward to describe and assess than the actual historical event itself. And the circumstances and the immediate impact of the conference of the Churchmen's Union that was held from the 8th to the 15th of August 1921 at Girton College, Cambridge. That particular conference has been relatively well documented by such commentators as Alan Wilkinson some time ago, Keith Clements. And I don't really want to enter into long discussions about the debates on Christology, the kinds of things that worried people in the 1920s. A great deal has happened in theology and in the church since then. And what was dangerously modern in the 1920s no longer seems particularly worrying to most people, or indeed challenging. In fact, probably for most people in this country, the doctrine of Christ is completely and totally irrelevant, especially the kind of nuances of all that. So what I want to try and do is to do something a little bit different from just getting bogged down in the history of theology in the 1920s. And instead, I want to look at the effects of the conference on the Church of England, and particularly on the way in which it led to a bit of a realignment of the church. What I want to show is that the Girton Conference occurred when the partisan makeup of the church was changing extremely rapidly. With the establishment of the Church Assembly, especially in 1920, self-government in the church, or at least a degree of self-government in the church, meant that the different church parties were very much more like political parties, as they were able to bargain for power within new structures of authority, rather than being kind of campaigning groups, pressure groups that were outside the church. So now they're located in the decision-making bodies of the church itself. And that meant that they could bring about change within the church in such thorny and divisive issues as liturgical renewal, or in the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. The people got as anxious about those sorts of things as they did over the doctrine of Christ. Those, of course, led to the debacle over the ill-fated 1928 prayer book. The existing literature tends to treat the Girton Conference as a controversy about the doctrine of Christ, which was obviously important at the time, but equally important was the effect that it had on the identities of the different groups within the church. I think what's really important about it is the effect that it has on consolidating the identity of Anglican liberals, or modernists as they were often called at the time. In many ways, it's an example of the different parties clamoring for power in the system of institutionalized conflict that inevitably emerges once you get self-government adopted by the church. So what emerged was a form of ecclesiastical politics that was really modeled on the partisanship of the House of Commons. It was conscious modeling on political structures. So there was a changing dynamic of church parties, and those have become increasingly political and were seen sometimes as kind of representative of interest groups. It's interesting to be talking in the week where we're getting General Synod election announcements and to look at the changing kind of constitution of the church, the changing nature of that body and the different parties clamoring for power. So what emerges is this very different kind of picture of how the church is governed. So the old squabbles in the church that tended in the olden days to take place in the courts and in meetings, they were increasingly taken over by the conflict within the church itself, within the church structures. And what I find particularly interesting as a historian of the church really is that reorientation of church parties that emerges in the 20th century, that means that liberalism becomes increasingly consolidated as a kind of third party, as a rival to the historic parties. And in turn, it can unsettle the balance of power. So the Girton Conference is central to the rise of liberalism within the church against an increasingly self-confident Anglo-Catholicism and a somewhat beleaguered evangelical party in the 1920s. But first of all, let me just look at one or two of the immediate effects of the conference. And I'll just share I won't spend all my time sharing pictures, but I hope you can see a picture of what Girton Conference, a new college built for women, what it looked like in the 1920s. And the immediate impact of the conference is important. I think it's worth remembering just what the conference itself was really like. It was a small affair held in what was a relatively new college by a new body, the Churchmen's Union, as it was called at the time. It had only been established in 1898, and it was a movement within the Church of England for the advancement of liberal religious thought. It was rather more establishment than other kind of liberal groupings. There was a liberal grouping associated with the Hibbert Journal, for instance, a kind of pan-denominational liberal journal. Or there was another journal called the Christian Commonwealth that was supposed to be liberal without being lawless. That's how it described itself, and modern in its sympathies. Compared with those networks, there were lots of Unitarians and outsiders in those networks. The Churchmen's Union was very much a churchman's union. It was associated with the Church of England and was generally really quite orthodox compared with those other religious groupings. And I think in hindsight, the furore and the uproar that were provoked by the Girton Conference, with calls for heresy trials, recommitments to the creeds by clergy, all of those were rather out of proportion to the content of the papers. If you look at the papers themselves, most of what they contain is remarkably unradical. Certainly if you compare it with earlier controversies in the church, like the Colenso affair over the errant Bishop of Natal in the 1860s, or Essays and Reviews, a collection of fairly radical essays published in 1860. Compared with those controversies, it was altogether rather less dramatic. What's also important is that there were no bishops involved. So the highest dignitaries that could be mustered at Girton at the conference were a canon of Ely and a former headmaster, M.G. Glazebrook, the aged, relatively aged Dean of Carlisle, Hastings Rashdall, and a Cambridge professor, J.F. Bethune Baker. And the main controversy really revolved around the contributions of the latter two. They were probably the two most senior clergymen who were presenting. While all were undoubtedly eminent in their own fields, their notoriety never really matched that of Hensley Henson, for instance, who'd entered into extraordinary controversy over his appointment to be Bishop of Hereford in 1918, partly because he appeared to doubt the virgin birth, and that led to a huge furore. But in many ways, the Girton Conference was something of a repeat performance of the sorts of issues that had emerged over the doctrine of Christ in some of those earlier controversies. It was much like the controversy provoked by the contributions to the edited collection, a book called Foundations, that was published 9 years beforehand, just before the First World War, and the sort of overblown reactions by conservative Anglo-Catholic bishops, especially Charles Gore, Bishop of this Diocese of Oxford, in fact my neighbour over the wall from where I live, as well as the great Frank Weston, Bishop of Zanzibar. But there was lots of really overblown discussion of that book, the debates over the person of Christ, sometimes about his resurrection, sometimes about his virgin birth, and sometimes the very coherence of the incarnation itself. All of those are matters over which church leaders had become extremely anxious, lest the creeds should appear to be watered down. And that controversy over foundations, was still raging really at the outbreak of the First World War. And it followed the pattern of the provided by the critics of the broad church tradition, represented by Benjamin Jowett and Essays and Reviews, 50 years before that. There'd been a very vigorous outcry then, and that had led to a trial before the Privy Council. Many people had tried to stop Frederick Temple, one of the contributors, becoming Bishop of Exeter in 1870. But after the First World War, those kinds of controversies were no longer possible. The Privy Council was no longer involved. Court cases were really extraordinarily difficult to organise for people who were considered to be errant in their faith. So 50 years after those kinds of discussions, the disputes over the Girton Conference were heated, even if the church was left now to deal with its own problems, as no longer were the courts particularly interested in ecclesiastical causes. So the pattern of the complaints against the contributors was relatively familiar. Church leaders of firm opinions, especially the recently retired Bishop Gore, along with a new breed of militant Anglo-Catholics, such as the redoubtable C.E. Douglas, who was one of the most, campaigning clergymen of the mid-20th century, strong supporter of the Eastern churches. People like him grew very anxious about theologians sliding away from doctrinal purity as they sought to make the Christian faith a little bit more palatable to the fabled modern man, or at least the modern white European man. This they regarded as the thin end of the wedge, which would mean that the Church of England would lose its birthright and the inheritance of the faith of the apostles. So as in the debates just before the First World War over foundations, there were lots of calls for clergymen to be made to declare their assent to the creeds. But it must be said that if one reads through the conference papers after 100 years, it's hard to find much that would shake the foundations of the creeds. It certainly looks to us, at least from 100 years afterwards, like a bit of a storm in a teacup, certainly in comparison with essays and reviews. Although there's a modicum of loose language here and there, there's very little that would nowadays be regarded as particularly heterodox, even by the most conservative of scholars. Lots of the findings then are now quite widely accepted right across the board. Indeed, I think despite the often very heated debate at the time, there were very few in the Churchmen's Union who sought a radical change of direction for the Church of England. There weren't many people like R.J. Campbell with his kind of new theology, as it was called, before the First World War, wanting to sort of reshape everything in a very kind of Unitarian direction. At least within the mainline churches, orthodoxy was still pretty much triumphant. But William Sandy, one of the most important figures in theology at the time, he was Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Oxford. He said that the fracas over foundations before the First World War, he wanted to say this: I believe that the cultivated modern man may enter the Church of Christ with his head erect, with some change of language due to difference of times, without any real equivocation of his heart. So a bit of a change of language, but hardly cutting-edge radicalism, just a little tweak here and there. And again, from the perspective of 100 years, the Girton Conference reads as a snapshot of theological debate and controversy, which is shrouded very much in the presuppositions and the language of the 1920s, or in many ways, of the pre-1920s. In many ways, the papers represent very little that was particularly novel. So look, I'll just offer a very little taster of what was being said at the time. First of all, apart from a very modest recognition of the impact of an eschatological interpretation of Jesus's teaching on the kingdom of God, where Jesus is the one who announces the end of the world, kind of teaching that had been espoused by Germans like Johannes Weiss and Albert Schweitzer. There was remarkably little that located the essays in the post-war context of Reconstruction. The papers very much represent the kind of pre-modern, pre-First World War liberal Protestantism, as well as the kind of dominant idealist philosophy, the kind of Oxford idealist philosophy that continued to dominate theology at the time, especially theology that derived from both Oxford and Cambridge. So let me just show you one or two of the characters associated with this. I can share my screen again. So here is a picture of two of the most important characters associated with it. On the left, J.F. Bethune Baker, and on the right, Hastings Carlyle. A man, I've never seen a picture of him smiling, incidentally. I think I've already mentioned that the two papers that created the greatest stir were by Rashdall, who was really the older statesman of liberal theology. He wrote on Christ as Logos and Son of God. And Bethune Baker was Lady Margaret's Professor of Divinity at Cambridge. And he wrote on Jesus as both human and divine. And between them, those papers contain very little that would trouble most modern readers. Rashdall's paper developed a kind of late idealist degree Christology, where Jesus is the sort of the summit of what it is to be human, in order to try to translate the terms of traditional doctrine, of kind of Chalcedonian doctrine, into modern thought. His essay is a little bit loosely phrased in places, but it doesn't really do much that is different from many other idealist thinkers of the time. Similarly, Bethune Baker's paper is far from radical, even if his terminology ended up being rather provocative. He said this: I say my conception of God is formed by my conception of Jesus. The God I recognize is a supreme person like Jesus in all that makes personality. So Jesus is the creator of my God. And that was a pretty radical thing to be saying in 1921. Jesus is the creator of my God. But it's not something that was necessarily inherently unorthodox. One can fit Orthodox Trinitarianism within that framework quite straightforwardly. It's just a rather challenging way of putting things. Despite that occasional lapse, however, most of the speakers were far more concerned with defending a liberal form of orthodoxy against far more extreme forms of liberalism. Those were represented at the time by F.J. Folkes Jackson, an Anglican who was then teaching in the Union Theological Seminary in New York, and Kersop Lake, who'd had to leave the Church of England over a divorce and was teaching in Leiden in the Netherlands. And they wrote a book together called The Beginnings of Christianity, which rather downplayed the religious genius of Jesus Christ. And that appeared to many people altogether rather more shocking than anything that Rashdall and Bethune Baker had said. Now, the shared educational background of most of the speakers at the time, and really they've all been raised in much the same kind of way, in a kind of Victorian Edwardian England. They had an underlying ethos of progress and development. And you find that that's all pervasive through most of the papers, including those by the lesser figures, a kind of Platonist tradition of a ladder of perfection, for instance, shapes Rashdall's approach to Christology. It's just a standard idealist kind of trope. It also had implications for the way in which Christology related to the wider civilization. This was obviously the heyday of the British Empire, which had just got a little bit bigger with all the German territories coming as mandates after the First World War. Nations themselves were often seen in this kind of ladder of perfection, and obviously at this stage many people perceived the British Empire to be at the kind of the highest rung of that particular ladder. Nations were maturing just as people matured in order to grasp the divine. So for men like Rashdall, there was a kind of hierarchy, both in Christ, in the church, and among the races as well. There is quite a shadow side to Rashdall's teaching. Doesn't come out particularly in the paper. But you do find it as well in another figure who is the most important figure in the development of modernism at this time, of Anglican modernism. And that's the figure of Henry Major. Henry Major, a fascinating character who led the Churchmen's Union almost from its beginning, and then became principal of Ripon Hall, one of the sort of the partners that came together to form my own college in 1975. But Ripon Hall had Henry Major as its principal through a great deal of the 20th century. He was editor as well of the Journal of the Modern Churchman. So he was very much there as the kind of the force behind the development of the Churchmen's Union. Really, it was his idea to put on conference at Girton. He wrote the introduction to the conference papers. And in that, he saw, he thought that by discarding unnecessary doctrinal accretions, the difficult bits, there would then be a new possibility for a truce between the denominations. So it was a kind of ecumenical gesture, so that then you could achieve reunion of the denominations at home. And then he felt Christian civilization could be built up in India and the East, he says, and a new generation of English men and women could be won. So to do all this would require shedding something of what he called the doctrinal and liturgical uniformity of the Tudor ideal of church government. So for Major, it was quite clear that despite the bloodiest of wars, things could very much still get better. So he doesn't have that kind of bleak apocalyptic sense that you find in other parts of theology at the same time. So if one goes to Switzerland, Germany, you can find Karl Barth writing at exactly the same kind of period with a rather different approach to how they perceive their own times. For Major, things can still get better. The British Empire is still taking its message across the world. That said, although the aims of the conference were really quite ambitious, There was at the same time very little that was particularly original or new. Henry Major followed in much the same direction as William Sandy had done before him, posing a question to his conservative opponents. Will they accept the affirmation God was in Christ, with the practical recognition that in daily life Jesus is Lord? Will they see that as constituting the irreducible minimum for modernist membership of the church? So simply a declaration that Jesus is Lord. For Major, as for some of the other contributors, Christ's divinity was certainly not an open question. It wasn't open to debate, but it remained a doctrinal minimum, even if it was to be shorn of some of its metaphysical presuppositions. So even if the papers themselves weren't as disturbing as was claimed by many of their opponents, in many ways the opponents create a kind of straw man, what remains important is the longer term effect they exercised on the Church of England. Most crucially, the church's context had changed after the war, which meant that the term liberal was gradually transferred into the name of a party in the church, rather than just an adjective that was applied to some other party in the church, like Protestant or Catholic or evangelical. So what was distinct about the Curtin Conference was the part it played in the strange mutation of the liberal or modernist method of critical and doctrinal engagement into a specific church party. So what was a method becomes a party. So rather than being simply the dominant ideology of the kind of educated elite of the Church of England, the people often labelled as broad churchmen, it was transformed into one of the parties alongside the others. So the Girton Conference and its aftermath, especially the setting up of the Archbishop's Doctrine Commission a few years later, that played a crucial role in the development of this kind of three-party model of the Church of England that still dominates some of the identity myths of Anglicanism across the world. Now, the post-First World War period was not a particularly auspicious time for English liberal theology. Many of the most influential theologians, such pre-war figures like William Sandy or F.C. Burkitt at Cambridge, many of them were influenced greatly by patriotic Germans like Adolf von Harnack, whose theological systems would be forever tainted by for many people by their support for Germany's war aims. And at the same time, the wartime alliances with Orthodox nations, especially Serbia and Russia, led to a new interest in Eastern Orthodoxy, particularly from Anglo-Catholicism, whose traditional anti-liberalism had been confirmed through the course of the war. Anglo-Catholicism had also been strengthened by the success of the Anglo-Catholic Congress of June and July in 1920, just a year before the Girton Congress, which meant that it was moving from its own self-identification as a kind of countercultural rebellion on the margins of the church with its own particular causes and campaigns, things like reservation of the sacrament. It was becoming far less sort of as a kind of marginal movement and much more something that was moving very much into the mainstream of the church. Henry Major noted that in some of his more anti-Catholic asides in his introduction to the papers. In fact, Henry Major remains very much a Protestant and an anti-Catholic right to the very end of his career. But in the early 1920s, evangelicals were equally anxious about policing boundaries, most obviously over permissible interpretations of scripture and over substitutionary atonement. But they tended to do that in isolation from the rest of the church. This was the real weak time of evangelicalism, the low point of evangelicalism. There was a split between the Church Missionary Society and the Bible Churchmen's Missionary Society over biblical interpretation in 1922. So it's into this kind of a heady atmosphere that you get the establishment through the Enabling Act of 1919 of the Church Assembly in 1920. Here I will just show you a picture of the early Church Assembly. And you'll notice one thing about it is that there are women there, but there aren't very many women there. The bishops are in general wearing their gaiters. It's altogether a very different picture of the General Synod. The man addressing it, incidentally, is the Anglo-Catholic controversialist C.E. Douglas. But anyway, the Church Assembly strengthens partisan identity in the early 1920s because the English Church is increasingly devolved from the state and becomes its own quasi-political organisation with competing visions of theology and truth, clamouring for control, just as different political parties were clamouring for control. So as the Church adopted its kind of form of democracy, so it based its systems and structures on those of the English political system with competing parties. And all that meant that for Gore and for other campaigners were able to use the controversy following the Girton Conference to promote further partisan identity through efforts at forcing subscription to the creeds by clergy, even if those things proved unsuccessful. So the invention of the Church Assembly made holding together the theological tensions and identities of the Church less a matter for the pragmatism of diocesan administration and the legal system, and far more a matter for institutionalized kind of parliamentary conflict. That's what the Church Assembly, it's what General Synod is really all about, a kind of institutionalization of conflict. And that problem was also expressed in Parliament, as became apparent over the prayer book crisis later on in the 1920s. And that three-party model of the Church of England, here are, as far as I could find, photographs that might be useful for identifying those three parties. It gives you some idea. It's hard to find a picture of liberalism, actually, but anyway, I thought that was the best that I could find in the bottom right-hand corner. But the three-party model of the Church of England was consolidated in the fallout of the Girton Conference and dominated the ways in which English theology developed in the 50 years or so afterwards. All of that was noted by Stephen Sykes. He was Van Mildert Professor of Divinity when he wrote a book in 1978 called The Integrity of Anglicanism. It's a rather slight but very provocative little book. Sykes's book was intended as a contribution to the Lambeth Conference of 1978 and offers a rather vigorous critique of this three-party model of Anglican comprehensiveness. He felt that destroyed the coherence of Anglican theology and of Anglican method in a very sort of messy compromise that would never really satisfy anybody. So Sykes thought that the idolizing of partiality, of fragmentariness, rather than seeing this all-embracing vision of truth to which great interpreters and leaders like Michael Ramsey himself had succumbed, meant that there was an exceedingly chaotic system of truth at the heart of the Church of England and the Anglican Communion. So he's a wonderful kind of hyperbolic writer. There is something corrupt about an institution, he said, which presumes to mould the Christian allegiance of its millions of members and officially states that it bears testimony to the gospel of Christ, but which is unwilling or unable to face the issues of belief which are apparent to any informed Christian. So toleration of diversity, or comprehension, according to Sykes, had to be set against this kind of integrity of truth. And that's the virtue he finds to be almost entirely absent in his exposition of the Lambeth Conference resolutions, as well as the reports of the Church of England throughout the 20th century. The real bogeyman behind this incoherence, according to Stephen Sykes, is excessive Platonizing, particularly by people like F.D. Morris and Michael Ramsey. They were altogether responsible for the often repeated claim that there is no such thing as Anglican theology. Now, in amongst all of Stephen Sykes's rather elaborate rhetoric, there is a very brief analysis of the Girton Conference, perceived from the vantage point of the Church of England in 1978. Stephen Sykes claims that the modernists who were behind the conference have had an absurdly bad press, and he didn't really set out to test the doctrinal limits. They didn't really set out to test the doctrinal limits of the Church of England and to see how far it could safely stray from Chalcedonian orthodoxy. And that, I think, he was completely accurate. They really don't want to stray from Chalcedonian orthodoxy. Instead, the position of most of the conference contributors to the conference was only a minor regional variant, he says, of that of many German liberal Protestants, which is absolutely true. A much less accurate statement in his discussion, however, is that there was a great deal of lingering idealism in their papers, and that philosophical idealism. That's what you find in Hastings' Rational. But I think for the biblical papers, they are very much just expressions of a kind of pre-war liberal Protestantism that was relatively orthodox. They challenged a few of the ways in which the Christian religion had been expressed in the past, seeking new appropriate forms, but they certainly didn't go very far. Far from hoping or intending to shock the orthodox in the wearisome manner of a group of middle-aged radicals, he said, the modern churchman had it in mind to provide an alternative to the rather bleak implications for Christology of some recent study by some fellow modernists. So he saw the Girton Conference as really quite a conservative meeting altogether. But he concludes, no one has ever suggested that the modernist movement is really the core of the Church of England in the way in which a generation of scholars have set out to canonize the liberal Catholics. Now, while that point might obviously be contested, what I think it's important to note is the way in which what he regarded as a relatively insignificant group of moderate critics was transformed into a church party. So for Sykes, far more important than what the modernists said was the reaction to the Girton Conference. And most important was the setting up of the Archbishop's Doctrine Commission in 1923, which wanted to examine the boundaries of legitimate expressions of belief within the Church of England. And it's that commission that really led to a sort of official recognition of this three-party model of truth that was identified with each of the three parties. So there's a kind of three lots of truths that are contesting it, battling it out within the Church of England. So initially, the Doctrine Commission was to have been chaired by Hubert Burge, Charles Gaule's successor as Bishop of Oxford. Burge, incidentally, had been one of the most staunch defenders of the contributors to Girton against their opponents. But following his death, the commission was handed to William Temple, who'd just become Bishop of Manchester. The statement of the commission's aims was published in 1925. The task, which could not be hurried, it said, was plainly a very big one, and the work is not of the sort that can be hurried owing to the amount of preparatory labour that has to be done between the full sessions. Its discussions have dealt with the various kinds of authority for religious belief and with the doctrine of God, especially with the relation between justice and loving God, and with his relation to the world, both in miracle and otherwise. While it's not yet been possible to reach complete agreement, there has been a far greater approach to it than most people who know the widely divergent schools of thought represented would have anticipated. The Commission is encouraged to hope that its labours may enable it to help materially the growth of mutual understanding and closer agreement in the Church of England, partly by showing that views often regarded as divergent are in fact complementary, partly, when this proves impossible, by elucidating the precise points at which unresolved differences exist. So there's no such thing as Anglican doctrine. There's simply lots of different doctrines that need to learn to live in a degree of harmony with one another. It actually didn't report until 1938. That was a really very slow report indeed, 15 years. And it was an early example, I guess, of the church kicking something into the very long grass. So those people who've criticised living in love and faith for being slow ought to look back at how the church did things in the past. Now, the report of the Commission is seen by Stephen Sykes as the finest example of the incoherence of Anglicanism, Anglican comprehensiveness, especially this idea that there is a kind of complementarity of truths between the three parties, rather than there being a kind of specific system of Anglican theology. In fact, the introduction to the report by William Temple quite explicitly rules out the possibility of a system of distinctively Anglican theology. That's because, he says, a systematic theology proceeds from premises regarded as assured, which he claims is impossible within the perpetual struggles of the Church of England. So he says, to claim that the Anglican churches are heirs of the Reformation as well as of the Catholic tradition and that they hold together in a single fellowship of worship and witness, those whose chief attachment is to each of these, and also those whose attitude to the distinctively Christian tradition is most deeply affected by the tradition of free and liberal culture, which is historically the bequest of the Greek spirit and was recovered for Western Europe at the Renaissance. We might also note that he's also speaking using the Church of England report to speak for all Anglican churches. Now, unsurprisingly, given his idealist background, Temple proposes a sort of synthesis between all three types of truth. For Stephen Sykes, that's a patent nonsense, since he thought that a distinctively Anglican method was required for the Church of England to be a church. It needed a singular version of truth. That said, Stephen Sykes himself never quite managed to pin that truth down, except in a rather high doctrine of episcopal oversight, which meant he didn't last that long as a bishop, and lots of invective against those who didn't think there was a distinctive Anglican method. So it may well be that Temple's solution was rather more attractive than Sykes claimed. It doesn't seem to me that humble and critical Reformed Catholicism, embracing all these different trajectories, might not be too bad a name for an Anglican method that moves beyond the partisanship that continues to infect the Church of England. But just to draw a few general points out of all this, I think Stephen Sykes' general point is well made. Gore and other sorts of people, somewhat unwittingly assisted by Henry Major and other liberals of the time, managed to push liberalism into a kind of box that made it mirror the historic church parties of high and low, or Catholic and evangelical. It's possible that the creation of a partisan form of liberal theology helped marginalize the movement by removing it from the mainstream of Anglican theology, which in the 1920s came to be dominated by Anglo-Catholicism. So the kind of critical broad church tradition, which had been the dominant ideology of establishment Anglicanism through much of the 19th century, all of that had been transformed into a kind of modest group of liberals associated with the modern churchmen. So just like the Liberal Party in politics, they'd been supplanted as the dominant group and the most influential group in the church by a new force. At this stage, it was a triumphalist Anglo-Catholicism, and that shaped the Church of England beyond all recognition in the 1920s for good or indeed for ill. The good news for liberals, however, was that many Anglo-Catholics came to adopt a strongly critical form of theology without succumbing necessarily to Henry Major's anti-Catholicism, anti-ritualism. They did the synthesizing that William Temple recommended, but which was increasingly difficult in a church that had been divided into three. Now, with the demise of Anglo-Catholicism since the 1970s, the new dominant ideologies in the Church of England seem to be rather less willing to establish a kind of humble, critical, reformed Catholicism than were the broad churchmen or the liberal Catholics of the past. And that may simply reflect the collapse of the sort of Christian civilization that had been associated with the British Empire and the Anglican Communion as they reasserted themselves after the First World War through the League of Nations and through a re-energized Lambeth Conference in 1920. So the Girton Conference may have helped divide the church into three, but I think it was also a symptom of a church that was beginning to struggle for its own identity against the backdrop of the beginnings of the decline and ultimately the collapse of Christendom, when very few people cared any longer about the sorts of disputes that emerged at Girton. Girton, in many ways, pushed conflict in the church to within the church, rather than it being part of a much broader societal kind of understanding of how God relates to the world. One can't blame Girton for that. It's a symptom of its times, but I think it's a good illustration of the kind of movements that were happening in the Church of England in the 1920s. So that's enough. And I hope people have got a few questions. So I shall just share my last slide, which is the end perhaps of Christendom, but also certainly the end of my lecture.
Mark, thank you very much for that. I really appreciated that, not least because Stephen Sykes was my doctoral supervisor some years ago. And I remember in The Identity of Christianity, he talks about Christianity being an essentially contested concept. And it seems to me that it's pretty hard to argue for a single form of identity if it's an essentially contested concept. And maybe he was asking for something that couldn't be delivered in that respect. And maybe in that way, Girton and that liberal movement were kind of, as you say, symptomatic of something that was happening in a different kind of way anyway. And maybe that's, maybe he tried to have his cake and eat it, I think, perhaps a little bit in that. Our comms officer, Joe Priestley, is sitting somewhere near Lincoln Cathedral and will let us know if there have been any other questions or comments directed to us from the YouTube channel. Joe, have we got anything at the minute?
Yeah, I've had one question in, and that is, do you see processes such as LLF as at least creating a common language, if not a common outlook, for the three parties within Anglicanism to talk to one another? That's it.
I mean, I suppose it's interesting to reflect on what's happened to, because I think there's a great deal of fluidity and boundaries, much more so than there may have been in the past. I mean, there are smaller groups that are undoubtedly quite entrenched and certainly define themselves over and against other groups, which has been traditional sort of how parties work. You know, you define yourself by what you're not through kind of opposition. You can find that with some conservative evangelical groups or the sort of the most traditional Catholics, that kind of thing. But there's a great deal of fuzziness. And I mean, this is interesting teaching over the last 30 years here in Cuddesdon, just how little partisan identity there is now. A lot of people have experienced forms of Christianity, you know, lively kind of worship styles and all that sort of thing. But the old kind of bugbears, the old sort of identity features, you know, things like candles on the altar and all that kind of thing, that's no longer, you know, it's not something that features at all in most people's understanding of those sorts of, you know, so the old sort of ritualist controversies, that just simply has disappeared. Now it's either skin deep or there's very little understanding at all of those kind of historic controversies. And in some ways, there's a kind of clamoring for identity in a lot of people that I experience. They're wanting to find some kind of identity there. And that may be why you know, issues of human sexuality, especially homosexuality, has become such a sort of polarizing thing, because that's become a kind of identity thing. It could have been all sorts of other things. It just happened on, and rather unfortunately, obviously, happens on this particular controversy. But it becomes a kind of bottom line identity thing. And that seems to me to be what's going on there. So it's a very different sort of makeup there. And I guess what's going on is to ensure that the you know, the LLF process and the whole sort of, I mean, I guess, you know, Archbishop Justin's sort of style of leadership is to encourage people to talk to one another. You know, that whole idea, I mean, I'm not sure good disagreement is a very good way of putting it, but the idea of having a mechanism so that people can listen and learn and understand without sort of, you know, anathematizing people all the time. You know, to beg to differ and agree to disagree without, you know, and that is, you know, that's how politics works. And in many ways, I guess it's the recognition that the church is this human institution that works in that kind of way. And I suppose that's a symptom in many ways of the adoption by the church of a form of you know, a democratic government, and that's how political systems work through the institutionalization of conflict. And I guess conflict is one of those things within the church that it's been extraordinarily difficult for the church to talk about, because it likes to sort of idealize Christian structures as somehow they're mirroring the Trinity or something idealistic like that, rather than being just as open to, you know, dispute and disagreement as any other kind of human institution. It might have high aims, but its practiced is often through you know, conflict. And anybody who's been associated with the PCC for any period of time will know that there are degrees of conflict at every level in the church. You know, from Archbishop's Council down to the local PCC. So it's in a sense of wrestling with that, and And since so much kind of human identity is associated with this, sometimes these things become very visceral as well. And the visceral questions in the 1920s are different from the visceral questions nowadays. It's interesting how few debates there's been about the nature of Christ, indeed the nature of God more generally. Sometimes it gets sort of about kind of universality of salvation, that sort of thing, but we haven't really had much since the myth of God incarnate stuff in the 1970s. It's quite a long time ago. People have been, they're anxious about other things now. I mean, the very survival of the church is what people are getting anxious now. The survival of the parish, it's a kind of inward-looking thing, but it is about the very survival of Christendom, the future in that kind of direction. So that's why I guess I'm thinking about the nature of Christian civilization as to how much of that is left and what is the role of the church and the Church of England in particular in the survival of that civilization in this country. So it's a portentous sounding title, but these are important questions, and by looking at what went on 100 years ago, one can get some idea of where we are today and just how phenomenally different things are.
Yeah. Joe, is anything else coming?
Oh, that's it online. Thank you.
Okay. I was interested, Mark, in how you related the sense of liberal progression in society, in the world, and in humankind, and all this, and the darker side of that. In days when issues around colonialism and the ways in which the church has participated in that, has left a lasting legacy as well. I just wondered if you want to comment any more on that slightly darker side, and whether that bears any relation to the rest of this.
I mean, I suppose in lots of ways it's to try and read things in their own read things in their own times. Rashtal, like many people of the time, he's the one who's been subject to a degree of controversy at the moment, because he once thought it would be better to kill a few Chinese for the sake of the white men. He wrote that directly in one of his volumes, and at the moment we still have a wing in our college named after Rashtal. So these are live issues, and it's the sort of roads must fall sort of discussions. But I think it does say something about some of those presuppositions about the sort of the development of the human personality do have repercussions on how we perceive the development of the personality. Is this the white Western personality? Is this something that is universalizable? And if so, does it mean that the people who don't share our culture are treated in a kind of infantilized way? And this is how quite a lot of imperial education works. So, one can understand it, and one needs to do some kind of rethinking about, well, how far did that infect theological systems more broadly? Concepts of formation, for instance, which is so strong in education as it develops in this country. Is that sort of, growing into full manhood, as it tended to be? Is that something that is effectively about becoming a good citizen of Britain, a good citizen of the British Empire? And those kind of connections are there, and they need unpacking. It's what I'm doing at the moment, looking at the development of a kind of this understanding of liberal theological method and educational method, and its kind of understandings of what it is to be human and how that relates to other cultures. And it's a fascinating story, and it's not straightforward, and it is much more nuanced than one might think. But it is a fascinating story, and that's probably it will be a subject of another lecture at some point. But it is something that I think the degree Christology is a very interesting idea. Where are all the different races in that kind of degree? Mm-hmm. They were asking those kind of questions at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting indeed, and it would make a very interesting lecture. So keep working on it. There is one more question through the YouTube. Given what you say about the nature of the conference papers, why do you think there were such strong reactions against them?
I think it was partly because of a particular and fairly, I guess, bellicose form of Anglo-Catholicism was suddenly in the ascendant, which was opposing, particularly antagonistic towards any kind of critical liberal thought at that stage. It took a little bit longer for it to sort of become a mainstream thing within Anglo-Catholicism later on in the decade. And in some ways, they're the people who sort of spearheaded the criticisms. And it was the old guard, like Gore, but also the new guard, like the Douglas brothers, who were, I mean, I guess they were rabble rousers, and suddenly they were in the ascendant in the church. So there were new alignments going on there. And again, for us, it's quite hard for us to grasp the sort of the excitement around that kind of Anglo-Catholic revival in the early 20s. It was a mass movement at a popular level, which was really reviving a lot of parochial life suddenly as well, because it had all been sort of countercultural and a bit naughty before the First World War, and you had sort of priests knowing that they were doing things that nobody would approve of, and they did it deliberately. After the First World War, suddenly it sort of became much more mainstream, and it lots of the the Oxford professors in particular were moving in that kind of direction. So you end up getting a much more conservative sort of movement establishing itself. So I think that's why you get quite a lot of quite strong reaction. It's there before the First World War, and it can also mobilize itself politically in a different way, because you've also got this body that can now make decisions for the church, limited, but they can make decisions for the church. So it does make a difference that there's a church assembly that's got these kind of parties represented within it.
Another question has come through on YouTube, and that is a very simple one. Has the term liberal Catholic sort of got lost now? Has it lost its meaning? Does it mean anything?
Like many of these things, what does liberal mean? What does Catholic mean in those kind of contexts? But I mean, I guess when it develops, I mean, liberal Catholic was a term coined by Bishop Gore, in fact, and it meant a Catholic who was somebody who was open to a critical approach to Scripture and tradition, in the sense of asking questions about that. I think it came then to be for once you get the kind of the revival of liturgical renewal and all of that side of things, it was people who adopted that approach and ceased to be anti-ritualistic, which was the traditional pattern of the modern churchman through the right through to the 1950s. They really resisted kind of Anglo-Catholicism, lock, stock and barrel. And then it changes in the 60s with liturgical renewal, and so you get a much more blending of the moves. So in some ways, the liturgical renewal is a success of liberal Catholicism. So the widespread parish communion movement, all of that, is very much a success of that. And obviously, that's now challenged by other groups. The sort of the much more free-for-all worship style that you might get in more charismatic churches, challenging the sort of that kind of identity of Anglicanism. So I don't think it's disappeared, but it's a difficult thing to pin down.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really grateful. We are all really grateful for your talk tonight. Putting something like the Girton Conference in a longer historical perspective is actually really important, I think, not to lose sight both of roots but also of movements that come out of events like that. So thank you very much for leading us through that and for responding to the various points that have been raised as well. Very grateful to you for that. Can I just remind everybody who's watching that we meet again same time next week, 7:30 on the 21st of October, when Jonathan Clatworthy will be giving a lecture on imperial theology and the Nicene Creed. So thank you very much for participating in this. And to those of you who are viewing this at another time, I hope you had something good to do on that night, because you missed